I grew up in a time of peace, and yet just in the last 2 years, the world has become kinetic, with Russia-Ukraine, Israel-Palestine, and more conflicts on the horizon. The world has not been this close to the brink of war since the fall of the Soviet Union. The English composer Benjamin Britten's War Requiem is made for times just like ours. Britten composed the piece to commemorate the Second World War, to immortalize painful lessons about war through music and art, because the only way we can avoid a repeat of history is to learn from it. My guest today is the legendary Martha Nussbaum, who will help us understand what Britten wanted to communicate to future generations through his masterpiece, and how we should think about war today. Tell us about Benjamin Britten's War Requiem and why you decided to write a book about it.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this book. It's an unusual thing within philosophy. I think even in aesthetics, most philosophers are talking about fine art or film, and very few are talking about music. But I guess classical music has always, since I was 6 years old, has been a very important part of my life. I go to lots of concerts and operas, but I also sing. And so I've really, it's just woven into the fabric of my life. And I've loved the War Requiem. This work stood out for me as a work that makes a major statement about not only war and peace, but about the human heart and what we should be like if we're going to be responsible citizens of a troubled world.
Right. So the War Requiem was written in the 1960s, right, to commemorate World War I and World War II. And so it's Benjamin Britten's reflections on these world wars. And I think that's quite relevant a topic today because, I was born in 1997, and for the first 2 decades of my life, I knew basically a world completely in peace. And yet in the last 2 years, with both Russia and Ukraine, as well as Israel and Palestine, a lot of the world has spiraled back into war, which is very frightening. So what do you think the War Requiem has to say to our age today, and also specifically to the participants in those conflicts?
Well, let me make just one small correction. It was written officially. His commission was to rededicate Coventry Cathedral after its bombing in World War II. So it was premiered in 1962, and it was about the Second World War. Now, the connection to World War I comes from the fact that he chose to set the text to Wilfred Owen's poems, which were written about World War I. And that actually creates, as I say in the book, quite a serious problem, because I think the Second World War is a just war, if ever there is a just war. Most of Britain's compatriots did too. All kinds of artists and writers like Iris Murdoch, W.H. Auden, they were all involved in the war effort. And in the U.S., of course, even Pete Seeger, who was certainly a famous lefty pacifist in some ways, he enlisted in the army right away, and he wrote this song, Dear Mr. President, telling Franklin Roosevelt to get into the war, kill Hitler, et cetera, et cetera. So World War I was very different. It was pointless. Wilfred Owen's point is that it's the big capitalists who are making war on each other, and it has nothing to do with concerns of the common people, and the common soldier is being used as a pawn in these games that have nothing to do with them. So I think Britten was kind of mingling the two in a way that I find quite problematic. But in any case, that's the connection. Now, in the end, I think what his focus is on the future, and about how nations that have been at war should reconcile and move to the future with cooperation and alliance. And so in that case, it doesn't matter. The difference between the two world wars doesn't matter so much. And what he did was to cast the leading roles, an Englishman, a German, and a Russian. Well, the Russian wasn't, the Soviets wouldn't allow her to perform at the premiere, but that was Britain's hope. And so the idea was these great powers now need to decide how to conduct themselves so we will have a world at peace. Now, as for today, well, of course, I grew up during the Vietnam War, so I'm not like you. I was born in 1947. So, but, and in between, of course, there was the Korean War. But don't forget, in your lifetime, there have been many other wars, the war in Bosnia and Serbia, and all kinds of smaller wars in Africa. So it just isn't the case that it's only Ukraine that's, made us aware that war is not at an end. And I think the idea that people had, particularly after the League of Nations was formed after World War I, that we would end war for all time. I think by now everyone thinks that's a naive idea. And if we can strengthen international cooperation, we might make wars less frequent and less devastating, but no one thinks that war will be ever at an end. So we have to be prepared for how to think about it.
I see. Well, we're going to focus the rest of the interview to talk about how we should relate to war, almost like a philosophy of war. And partially, if my understanding is correct, the reason that Britten equated the world wars was because of his completely pacifistic stance. So in his mind, there is no just war, right? No violence, no use of force is justified. And like you, I find that to be a somewhat implausible position. But before we critique it, I was wondering if you could steelman the position a bit. I was wondering if you'd give us possibly the best defense or the best justification of where he was coming from.
Well, he was part of a group in Great Britain. I think this has never been so common in the US, who followed Gandhi. Some of them actually went to study with Gandhi. And Gandhi really did think that. He thought no use of violence, even to kill a marauding animal or a rabid monkey, he goes into great detail about this, is ever justified. Even personal self-defense is not justified. And so he's very extreme, and very few of the students of Gandhi go quite that far. For example, Gandhi therefore not only didn't eat meat, but he also he was a vegan, and most followers of Gandhi in Britain ate plenty of meat and never paid attention to that part of it. So what Gandhi was smart about was saying to the Indians, don't fight back the way the British do. Make them look silly. Make them look small. Stand up and be proud and take the blows without violence. And that was not only his normative view, but it was a very effective strategy. But that was a particular situation where he was dealing with the British, who were actually not very thuggish. They were pretty thuggish, but they weren't prepared to kill millions of people. He tried to apply the same tactics to Hitler. And he said,
Gandhi did. Gandhi did?
Gandhi did.
Wow.
And Greg, I think probably did too, but that's not clear. Gandhi said, it really doesn't matter whether Hitler wins or loses. But what I want to do is to convert Hitler by the power of nonviolent love. And that, at that point, it becomes ridiculous, right? But it was only because he didn't care who won the war that he could even say that. Right. And of course, most people thought it really did matter quite a lot who won the war. Right. So I think the best defense is, in many situations, it is actually a good strategy, and it's an effective strategy, as well as being more pleasant in the sense that you're not spiraling into more and more violence. But it certainly wasn't a good strategy with Hitler, and it was, here's Pete Seeger saying, "Give me a gun," and that seems to be a reasonable strategy when you're talking about Hitler. So I do think Britain hadn't even really. He was brought up with privilege. He was a very spoiled young man, and I think he just really didn't face the world realistically.
I see. But to dig into this philosophical underpinning of Gandhi and therefore Britons, is the idea that our inner peace, our internal sanctity, is so important that it is worth not defiling with external action. So I studied a lot of Buddhist philosophy, and you read, for example, when the Muslims invaded India, and this is why Buddhism was wiped out, a lot of the Buddhists just sat in the temple and just waited to be slaughtered. Because behind that act of nonviolence, there was also a metaphysical view of reincarnation, right? So it actually does, not only am I not doing violence, I'm just going to get reincarnated in possibly a better form. So what are the philosophical underpinnings behind this complete pacifistic view?
Well, first of all, let me make a distinction that I think is very important between a pacifism about actions and what I call emotional pacifism. Now, emotional pacifism means trying as hard as you possibly can, although you may not be completely successful, to get on top of your aggressive instincts, your desire to trade blow for blow, to pay back pain with pain, and just to be a person of peace who treats others with respect, empathy, and consideration. Now, then there's the pacifism of actions, and says, do no violence. And that, is certainly, you can see the connection, because if you're a person of inner peace, in general, you're not going to want to kill people and so forth. But you can be an emotional pacifist and still think, in this particular situation where my country is about to be gobbled up by Hitler, I better get a gun. And the trouble is, though, how do you do it? I mean, I think the psychology of the fighting soldier is very tricky here. And I actually lectured at West Point some years back, and they were really puzzled about how to train combatants to lead for a just cause without running amok, because they were haunted by the specter. Do you know the My Lai massacre in Vietnam? It was a massacre led by Lieutenant William Calley. That was their bogeyman. He was an officer who led his men to slaughter huge numbers of civilians under the pretense that they were really enemy combatants. And that was always difficult in Vietnam to say who was a combatant and who wasn't, because they didn't dress up in uniforms. So anyway, that was what they didn't want people to be like. They wanted soldiers to be self-contained, controlled, people of inner courage and inner peace on top of their aggressive instincts. And then if they go into battle and kill people, it's because of a rational calculation of moral necessity. My nation needs this to survive. That's the theory. And of course, it's a perfectly coherent theory, but it's much harder in the actual act. I mean, there you are in the jungle, feeling absolutely awful. Most of the American troops were stoned half the time because they couldn't stand the heat and the squalor of the jungle. And you see some people coming toward you. And where's your inner peace? What do you do? Well, of course, what you do is rely on the instructions you get from your officers. And there were so many officers who gave quite bad instructions. More and more came to light every year after the war.
So what I'm hearing is that your attempt to make Britten and Gandhi's nonviolent position plausible, at least theoretically, is to turn it from a pacifism from actions, right? We're going to use love. We're going to use love to convert Hitler, to a pacifism of emotion. It's okay to pick up a gun and fight the Nazis, but the ideal, at least, is to not have violence or aggression or this idea of retributive anger towards them.
Right.
But my question for this view would be, why do you not see any use for vengeance and anger? So one example could be like game theoretical, right? Machiavelli talks about whether it's not exactly this case, but whether it's better to be loved or hated, right? Or feared. And Machiavelli infamously says it's better to be feared. And I also wonder if you are known as a vengeful person, might that deter certain people from wanting to attack you? Is there any use you see in anger and vengeance?
I think in some instances, the idea that you will strike certainly does deter, but that doesn't mean strike with vindictive intent. It might be, much more effective is striking because you love your country and you're determined to defend it. You think about Winston Churchill's blood, sweat, and blood, tears, and sweat, or whatever he said. He was not saying you go in there and take vengeance on the Germans. Not at all. He was saying that our freedom as Britons is precious and we must endure a lot of suffering. And yet, of course, that staunchness, that idea that we love our country so much that we're determined to suffer, that was a very great deterrent, because I think that's much better a deterrent than saying, oh, we hate you and we're going to strike. But seeing that these are people, and of course the idea of an island where all the people on this island are going to stand stalwart and defend themselves, that's much more effective than thinking you have a band of outlaws who are going to strike you. So I think even in terms of deterrence, the
right,
tension that's more self-contained is more effective.
Right. So this is very similar to the arguments from Seneca's on anger, right? Where it's not that anger has no use, it's that reason can do what anger does, but better, more controlled, and more successfully. That's the kind of argument.
I mean, it's sort of like that, except that it means there are other emotions that you call on. Love of your country, deep grief at the damage that has been done to your country, hope for the future of your country, all these things. And I think this is what Zelensky has been very effective at doing, that he doesn't say, oh, let's hate all Russians and stamp out Russian culture. If he slips in that direction once in a while, it's a mistake. But what he really calls on is love of our country, its freedom, its history, and its institutions. And that's what you can rely on. I mean, if people love their country, they will endure pain. If they're just trying to strike, then who knows? They might turn tail, run the next day.
Right. Let me read you a wonderful quote from your book that reveals how difficult this position of emotional pacifism is. Nelson Mandela said that it took much of his time in prison, 27 years, to uproot his desire for retribution. If this is true of that extraordinary leader, we can expect that most members of nonviolent movements will be less fully in control of themselves. Gandhi's followers lapsed during partition, whenever he was not actually present, lashing out in hatred. Mandela's followers, too, kept seeking various forms of retribution against white South Africans, and Mandela had to intervene often to turn them around. If this is true, even within committed nonviolent movements, what should we expect to find in war itself? Now, given the difficulty of this position of emotional pacifism, if my self-understanding is that if I go to war, all of these negative and bad emotions of vengeance and hate will overwhelm me, does the kind of Britten Gandhi withdrawal, like not engaging in war, does that seem more palatable?
I don't think so. I think what I was trying to bring out, and what Mandela always brings out, is that it really requires practice. Work on yourself. You can't just say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to become a person of emotional pacifism. But you really have to work on what it is in your personality that seeks vengeance. Now, of course, he was brought up, treated with great injustice, racism, and he was also a boxer. So he was taught this mentality of striking the first blow. And it was all that he had to unlearn. And he did have Stoic texts, in fact, in Robben Island prison. He had a copy of, it was Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And he thought that was really useful in talking about the inner practice and work you need to do. And meditating, why are you feeling a desire to strike right now? What could you do instead? What other kind of person can you be? And you read his letters and you see him working to address even his captors with respect and dignity. And always, always, he tried to understand their point of view. So when he was moved to a slightly better prison, he had this special private cook. He was about to be released. So they knew he was going to be the president of the country. So they treated him well. But the cook was an Afrikaner who really didn't like Black Africans. And Mandela knew that. But he had learned the Afrikaans language. Noted that itself is a hard thing to do for somebody whose language is not even related to that. It's an African language. So Mandela spoke to him in his own language. He found out about his family. He understood eventually that this is a man who himself had been ground down by the system, wasn't making a very good salary, was not very proud of what he was doing. So he could make an alliance with him. And I think the great thing that Mandela always did was to show empathy for the person who had previously treated him badly or who might treat him badly. And that's why the South African situation evolved the way it did, because every time one of the leaders met Mandela, they realized this is a man we can work with, this is a man who respects us, he sees our point of view, and we share a love of our country. And so he did all of that. When it came time to choose a national anthem, of course, the Afrikaner anthem that they had was absolutely abhorrent to Mandela's people. But he understood that a lot of people really loved that. And then they had their own anthem, Nkosi Sikelele Africa, which was the anthem of the freedom movement. But he realized the other people don't like that one. So we stitched them together. And the South African national anthem today has 2 verses from one and 2 verses from another, and then a final stanza in English about the future of the country. So that's what he understood, that you can only work, you have to work on yourself. And it's a very long and difficult task. People usually don't try.
Right, I see. Maybe let me try to frame my question in a slightly different way, which is that when it comes to fighting a just war, there seems to be two failure cases. One is to lose to an evil enemy, right, to be conquered externally. The other is to triumph against an evil enemy, but in the process become evil oneself, right, to have vengeance or anger or sort of overcome yourself. And this is an internal failure. What do you think is the most dangerous pole here?
Oh, well, of course, both are quite bad. And you don't want to lose who you are and win the war. Then you haven't got a country to build afterwards. So I think the very fact that the Second World War ended reasonably well, that Europe could be brought together, Germany was rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, that came out of the effort at getting on top of retributivism that Churchill and others had already put in place. So you have to do that first, and then afterwards you can figure out what you want to do next. Now, South Africa, of course, they're still struggling with this, and Mandela's ideas are not entirely in control. But anyway, as long as he was alive, that's what he was doing. He was preparing all along for the future and trying to get people who would be able to build a country together.
I see. Well, let's go back to the Requiem, because the Requiem intermixes, right, the Latin Mass for the dead with what you mentioned already, the Wilfred Owen, who is an English poet who died in World War I. Can you tell us a bit about what Britten hoped to achieve by this combination?
Okay, well, of course, he was invited by the Dean of Coventry Cathedral, and he knew it was an official occasion where the Queen would be present. So he did not want to do anything terribly shocking, but he still did want to make a strong statement in favor of emotional pacifism and reconciliation to lead people into the new decade. So the idea was that if we just have the Requiem Mass, well, that's an old text. And actually, by that time, entirely the Anglican Church had repudiated that text, and the Roman Catholic Church had just repudiated it. So it's a text that didn't fit the times. In fact, the Anglican Church, some years before, had thought that's just too vindictive. That's not how we should think of the life after death. God is not the God of vengeance. And so then we have the Roman Catholic Church that stuck around longer with that text, but eventually dropped it. It's not used. The Requiem Mass doesn't have that anymore. So he was operating in a situation where both major churches that were part of his audience were were emotionally pacifistic. They didn't think of God as a God of vengeance. They didn't think that your life after death would be one of violent punishment. And that's important. If you just take a look sometime at the funeral service for Queen Elizabeth II, what prayers were said, what things were read, and so not one thing talking about punishment of God's enemies, but it's all about love and bringing people together through love. That's what Christ is now taken to mean. So, of course, he wanted to send that message in a very forceful way. And he wanted to send it as a message about what war does to common soldiers. Because, of course, Owen's main point was that war was made by people who were at great remove from the people who are actually doing the fighting. A little bit less true in World War II than World War I, but in any case, it's always a problem. So by emphasizing the terrible toll of war on not only the common soldier, but on the people back home who were waiting in anxiety and then eventually mourning, that's where my title phrase comes from, the tenderness of silent minds. Those are the people at home who are thinking, what does this all mean? And they're mourning and waiting and hoping. He thought that by emphasizing those factors, he was contributing to the future of Britain, and the future of a Britain that would be European, that would cooperate also with the Germans eventually, and with the Russians, if the Russians were willing to join in, and of course the Americans at a distance. So that's his idea, is to emphasize reconciliation. And that was a great theme of his life. He had been treated, as I talk about in the book, pretty badly through his life in many ways. He was thrown out of school for writing about animal rights. And of course, then when he turned out to be three things that were thought very bad, namely a pacifist, a leftist, and a homosexual, he was treated very badly for all those things. And he and Auden actually left the country for a while. Auden never came back, but Britten loved England. And he really he couldn't imagine really living and making music any other place. He moved right back to the place where he had grown up, which is a rugged seacoast town where now there is a music festival that he and Peter Pears, his lover, founded called the Aldeborough Festival, which was his gift to the nation. I want to give them a music festival that includes everyone, that has music for amateurs, for children, and so on. And so he was, at this stage of his life, he was all about reconciliation. Now, as far as the partnership with Peter Pears, they had been together. They were together for 39 years. And so it was one of the longest creative partnerships, particularly within a kind of marriage that we know of. But by that time, although same-sex was still illegal until 1976, there had been a royal commission, the Wolfenden Commission, that had already declared that the laws were stupid and they had better be changed. So Britain, it's now time for reconciliation. So that was Britten's mood when he wrote the War Requiem. We're a nation that has been very divided by politics, by class, but also by sexuality. And now is the time, in the wake of this terrible war, which almost extinguished the nation, that we should all come together and embrace one another.
There's so much to talk about there, but maybe we can talk about the biblical tradition first, right? The Christian tradition, and because it seems like he brought in specifically a mass that was repudiated, right? Because he wanted to pull out a specific strand within Christianity, namely the strand of love and forgiveness, and to reject a different strand, right? And that's the idea of a vengeful, wrathful God. And in fact, there are certain parts of the musical composition that uses this idea of a vengeful God, right? I believe it's called the dies irae. It's almost like Revelations in the New Testament, right? Where God is, there's hellfire, God is exacting his vengeance. And my question is, how does Britten portray this musically? And with what devices of composition does he make it clear that this vengeful God is to be rejected?
Well, of course, the Dies Irae is in all the Requiem Masses. So in the musical tradition, everyone is going to set that if they're doing a setting of the Requiem Mass, even though both Catholics and Anglicans have rejected that and no longer use it. But he makes it clear. I mean, on the one hand, he wants to show what had been so terribly attractive about it, all the thunder and wrath and so on. But then we are led from there into, well, a number of steps, but there are parts of the Dies Irae itself that are key, which are more peaceful. The Pie Jesu verses showing Christ as being somebody who suffers but is not wrathful. But then we get to what I think is the key movement of the work, which is the Agnus Dei, where there he takes an Owen poem, which is called At a Calvary on the Ancre, Calvary meaning the crucifixion of Christ. And so here we have the common soldier being equated with the crucified Christ in Owen's poem. So one ever hung where shelled roads part, et cetera, et cetera. And this is set to the movement called Agnus Dei, Lamb of God who takest away the sins of the world, have mercy upon us. And the very last line usually is Lamb of God who takest away the sins of the world, grant them eternal rest, because this is the Requiem Mass for the dead. But Britten, and actually it was Pears, because it's in his handwriting in the score, rewrote that because it's not about the dead, it's about the living. So instead of Dona eis requiem, give them rest, it's Dona nobis pacem, give us peace. And so that's what we sing at the end of the Agnus Dei. It's for all the living to look forward to a world of peace. but through the idea that each common soldier being abused in this horrible carnage of war is rather like the abuse of Christ being killed because of the desire of all these different people. I mean, Owen describes the priests, the nations, and so who want to kill this young man. And Christ is killed because of the pride of people who just can't get it into their hearts that what they should be doing is to make peace. And this is sung. I mean, it's a wonderfully beautiful piece of music. I love to sing it, but since I'm a soprano, so I can sing it. But Piers is a high tenor, but of course a woman would never sing it in performance. But it's a beautiful work, and it's just so moving. And what it says is, this is the human body. This is the place where, in effect, the human body is revealed as the seat of the soul and the seat of love. And the message is, we got to love one another. That's what we got to do. And it inspires us to want to do that.
Another way that he transformed through Owen a traditional biblical account or Christian story is the Abraham and Isaac story, right? So tell us a bit about how the Abraham and Isaac story is changed in the Requiem.
Well, of course, the Abraham and Isaac story, I mean, I'm Jewish, and I often hear all kinds of views of this. For centuries and for millennia, it's been very controversial. Why would a just God ask Abraham to kill his son? Now, one very common answer, particularly a Jewish answer, is because Jews always like to argue about everything, so they don't think a text orders you to believe it. They say, we shouldn't believe it. And some say, well, Abraham obeyed God, but that was wrong. He shouldn't have obeyed God, so he fails the test because he obeyed rather than thinking for himself. Others think other things, but anyhow, there are many, many critical accounts of the Abraham-Isaac story. So the written version just says, well, let's imagine he actually did obey. What would that be like? But of course, the idea is we should not obey, whether it's obedience to a command or in the case of this heterodox version, obeying your own wrathful instincts, because Abraham now just wants to go ahead and do it. And so that's what we shouldn't be like. And that story gives us bad advice unless we think critically.
Right. And so just to clear it up for our audience, in the Requiem's telling, the angel says, here is a goat or a lamb instead of Isaac, right, which is canonical with the traditional account. And then Abraham hears the angel, recognizes that it's an angel, and kills Isaac anyway. And what that's supposed to show us is that this kind of violence and the violence of war is non-rational. It's when someone is being overtaken by irrational bloodlust. Is that right?
Well, it's whatever it is. It could be personal greed. It could be just wanting to be the winner. I don't think it's bloodlust necessarily. I think that's too easy, letting it off too easily. I think what he's saying is that people have all kinds of egocentric motives that lead them to go ahead when the right thing to do would be to withhold their vengeance. So yeah, I think that's the problem with the traditional story, is that it allows a starting point, and then you get off the track of that terrible starting point only because God changes his mind. And so Britten says, well, suppose that proceeded, what would it be like? And it would be like a man who just has whatever reason he has for wanting to strike back. And I think it could be lust, but more often I think it's something that he would think of as a good reason. They insulted me. They invaded my country, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, he wants to show that that's just a terrible thing to do.
In your own Jewish faith and practice, how do you make sense of the Hebrew Bible's depiction of an often wrathful and vengeful God?
I'm a Reformed Jew, so it's no special problem, because we think the Bible is historical. It's a record of a certain historical period, of a certain historical people. So when I give what's known as a Devar Torah, that is a speech about the Torah, I often say, well, the God depicted here was a primitive God who orders bad things, and we ought to think we ought to think critically about this, and we ought to refuse that idea. And that's just a very orthodox way of being a Reformed Jew. Other more traditional Orthodox Jews would have a harder time. But no, I think Reformed Jews just think the text, we're bound together by a common history. The text is a jumping off point for that history. And of course, we're not bound by it. I mean, it's sort of like the way that a philosopher thinks of the philosophical tradition that he or she is brought up on. I mean, no good philosopher would think, oh, well, here's Aristotle, we must obey him. No, I mean, when I teach Aristotle or Kant or any other thing, I would try to see what it contains. But then I'd say, okay, this is historical, and what he says about women we reject, and other things we might hold on to, and so forth.
I see. Let's zoom out a bit and talk about the form of the Requiem, which is music. What makes music a specifically adequate and fitting medium to talk about and discuss war?
Schopenhauer, whom I talk about quite a lot in the book, said that music among all the arts is the one that is closest to representing our emotions and our strivings. It was a representation of what he called the will. He thought human beings were divided into two tendencies, the tendency of representation, that is cognition, and then the will, which is emotional striving and surging and so forth. And so he thought, what's good about the arts is they show us ourselves, but at some remove, so we are not caught up in our daily lives. And what music does is show us our emotions, and most of them he thought were quite bad. I mean, Schopenhauer was a pessimist. He thought most human emotions were pretty bad. And it shows us the futility of love, which of course I don't agree with, but it also shows us the horrible futility of vindictive anger. And this is what I think music can do. And why is music especially good at it? Because, and of course it can have words with it, but unlike a prose drama, it has rhythm, it has dynamics, it beats into you, the clashing and bashing of a whole orchestra. So this is what makes music, to me, such a very fruitful way of thinking about war, because we feel it in our bodies. It gets to us. And when I think anyone who listens to the War Requiem, even if you don't have any musical education, finds it terrifying, moving, and then you have to go back and think, what happened here? What was I moved by? So I think music is quite unique. There are many kinds of music. I don't think it has to be classical music. I just saw the Bob Dylan movie, which I think was quite a wonderful movie, and it does show, in the era that he was in, what music can do to make us think about war and about peace and so forth. So whatever kind of music you love, that kind of music will get to you and show you something about yourself. And then, of course, if you put a text with it, as then Britten does, the traditional text, and then working against that is the Wilfred Owen text, then we get this wonderful combination of a sort of, Wagner said, Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art. I would call it a total thought work. It's like it summons us to critical thought on so many different levels.
Right, I see. There's a debate in philosophy between Schopenhauer, right, who thinks that the fragility of human endeavors renders them, to put it very simply, worthless. And on the other side, we have Aristotle, who thinks that despite the tragedy, the fragility of human projects, beauty can still shine through. You, of course, side with Aristotle. So give us a short explanation why.
Okay, well, here's Schopenhauer. He thinks if you're trying to get something, you think that thing is worthwhile, but then one of two things happens. Number one, you don't get it, and so that's bad. But number two, you do get it, and then you get bored. And it's very sad to be a person like that, I think, who never likes the things you get. But that's the kind of person Schopenhauer was. And so he thought that that's how we show people that the things of the world have no value. And so Aristotle, of course, has no such specious arguments. He just thinks tragedy hits you hard, you lose a lot, but in the very act of grieving, you acknowledge the worth and value of what you're grieving for. And, the value of what you lost is not negated by the fact that you lost it. The value of a human life is not negated by death. And as Aristotle says, the noble, it's not just the beautiful. Well, it's this funny Greek word, kalan, which can mean beautiful, but I think more often it can mean noble, and it's more than just beautiful. The kalan shines through, and that's what we're supposed to see. Now, I think Britten was a person who really was capable of great love of his country, love of Peter Pears, love of many things about the world. And what he wants is to create a work that shows the terrible devastation of war, but then, particularly in the Agnus Dei, shows the beautiful or the noble shining through. And that's why it's so effective to have just Peter Pears. Peter Pears had a very unusual voice. He had a very high tenor voice that was very clear and not much vibrato. And he really articulated the text with great clarity and simplicity. So this very unusual voice is standing there in front of you, so to speak, and impersonating Christ, but also the common soldier, and saying, here I am, ecce corpus meum, this is my body. That's what they thought they were doing. So Peter Pears, standing for Christ, but for the common soldier, shows the beautiful shining through, and the music does it so dazzlingly well. It's so simple. I think it's the great simplicity of the music and of the text, of course, that shows the dignity and the nobility of a human being. And this is what Peter Pears and Britten always wanted to show. They, of course, what everyone thought about a gay couple in those days is, oh, they're all about sex, they're really corrupt. And Lord Devlin, for example, who opposed the Wolfenden Report, said, oh, they're sex addicts and they're like drug addicts and so forth. He wanted to show, and this may be reactionary, and I think they were kind of reactionary guys, they wanted to show, no, our lives have commitment, dignity, beauty in our love. So in the Aldeburgh Museum, you can see 365 of their love letters. They didn't have too many love letters because they were together for most of their time, but they did. When Pears was traveling to present an opera or a concert, they did have letters. So all those letters he gave to the nation so they could see the beauty shining through. In spite of the persecution, here we are, two men who work together, who support one another, who love one another sexually, creatively, and in every way. So that is what he meant by the beautiful shining through.
Right. And what I find extraordinary about that is you mentioned how you don't find an ounce of torment in their psyche because of their sexuality. Even though they grew up in a society that was extremely hostile to their way of life. So can you share a bit more about what enabled this kind of radical self-affirmation, even when everything and everyone, almost everyone around you, is negative towards you?
Well, I don't. First of all, it's not everyone. That's the first thing to say. They always had friends. Britten came from a very loving middle-class family. And although he never told his mother that he was gay, I think she probably knew it, he never slept with Pears until after his mother's death. So he was a little bit worried about what she would think. But the sisters were gung-ho friends and supporters. And then there's the whole artistic culture that, not uniformly, but to some great extent, they accepted them. And the country was coming round to that. Nonetheless, of course, most of the country, even the ones who were kind of sympathetic to changing the laws, thought one reason to change them is that these people must be so terribly tormented. So I quote from the debates in Parliament where they say, oh, these poor people who were tormented, etc. And a lot of music critics do interpret some of Britten's works that way as signs of inner torment, etc. So I think they just thought that was silly. And it's sort of like women who hear all around them that women can't attain anything and can't achieve anything. I mean, I heard all these things all my life. How did I retain a kind of confidence and didn't get tormented by this? Well, number one, my father, I think, believed in me. And then I had lots of teachers But, in graduate school, I was pretty lonely, and I depended on the support of certain people, philosophers like Bernard Williams, Richard Wollheim, Stanley Cavell, who really wanted women to succeed. So you lean on what you have, and then you refuse to be tainted and corrupted by the other junk around you.
I see. Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for your time and for a fascinating interview.
Well, thank you so much for constructing such a wonderful interview. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at jonathanb.com. You'll not only get full-length episodes, but also transcripts, book notes, and invitations to my lectures. Now, if you like this interview, I think you'll enjoy my lecture series on mimetic theory, which also deals with reciprocal violence, warfare, and Christianity. You can find links to that series and everything we covered today in the description, as well as on my website, jonathanb.com. Thank you.